of English at the University of Cyprus, which is a relatively new university. We were talking yesterday about new universities, which dates back, what, 15 years?
Yes,
15, 16 years. Which is a university where the main language of instruction is Greek.
Yeah.
Stephanos Stephanides is like our previous speakers, Brian Castro and Alan Subushiko, not simply a critic and a teacher of literature, but also a practitioner. He also shares with Brian Castro a similar sort of experience of displacement, and his linguistic and cultural background is similarly multiple. Having been born and brought up in a Greek-speaking home in what was then the British colony of Cyprus and what is now Turkish-occupied Northern Cyprus, Stephanos left Cyprus to study in the UK. And having completed his undergraduate and postgraduate studies at the University of Wales at Cardiff, where he specialised in Hispanic studies and English literature, he became lecturer and then senior lecturer at the University of Guyana in South America. He also trained in professional translation and interpretation at Georgetown University in the United States, and is fluent, as you will see, of course, in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. He's worked as a researcher, translator, and an interpreter for several international organizations in Washington, D.C., and he was research fellow at the Center for Translation and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Warwick, and was research associate at the Center for Research and Translation at Binghamton, SUNY in the United States. Professor Stephanides' research interests span the fields of comparative literature, literary and cultural studies, post-colonial literature, translation studies, ethnography, and anthropology. His most recent publications all dwell on questions of translatability in the broader sense. He authored and edited recently with Susan Basnet a book called Translating Floating Islands, and also authored a book entitled Translating Kali's Feast. Despite the difficulties associated with translation, which we're all aware of, his own prize-winning poetry has been translated into a number of languages, including Lithuanian, and he himself is responsible for the translation of Cypriot poetry into English. The University of Cyprus, thanks in large part to the enthusiasm of Stephanos Stephanides, was a founding member of our International Institute for Diasporic and Transcultural Studies, and so his presence here today reinforces this multinational initiative that brings together Lyon, Liverpool, Cyprus, and Canton. So, Stephanos, thank you for being with us.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for being here. I hope you can all hear me. I chose this room because it has better acoustics, even though it doesn't have a microphone. I gave a very broad title. In fact, I was deferring saying anything, and I was happy Colin was not asking for titles. And then a few days before I came, I said, well, maybe you want a title. And I gave him the title of, I think, Transculturation and Critical Cosmopolitanism. But having been listening to you over the last couple of days, I feel I should have added the word nostos, because that's also one of my, that's also preoccupation, and it's something that when I think about cosmopolitanism, I link the idea of nostos and cosmopolitanism as both like impossible conditions. They seem contradictory conditions. One is like becoming a citizen of the world, and nostos is the idea of return or homecoming. And they go hand in hand and contradict each other, and they're both impossible. But I thought of it yesterday, listening to the session on travel literature and Macanese, and the idea of the culture of departure and the culture of arrival. That in translation, in English we talk about the source culture or the source language, and the target culture and the target language, but in French, I think you talk about the culture du départ and the culture d'arrivée. So the idea of translation being something between leaving somewhere, departure, and arrival, which links also very much to one of my favorite themes, narrative themes of the Odyssey, especially the second Odyssey. I wasn't aware of the second Odyssey till much later in life. I mean, I was always taught of the first Odyssey, which is the idea of which is impelled by the idea of nostos, and the nostos of homecoming and the desire to go back to Ithaki. But then I realized that there is a long tradition going back from antiquity of the second Odyssey of Odysseus actually either not wanting to go to Ithaki or getting there and not being happy and deciding to leave. And in fact, it was probably at the end of what I would call my second Odyssey, when I went back to Cyprus. I repatriated, as they say, in 1992, that I discovered an unknown poem by Cavathis, in which it's an earlier poem to his Ithaki poem, which you probably all know, in which he sees the homecoming as a continual deferral, that the destination, the culture of arrival is Ithaki, but you have to keep deferring it. Whereas in the earlier poem, he actually goes back and he says, well, this place is too small for me. And he hands it over to Telemachus, and he goes on to a new journey beyond Hesperia. And this is a tradition that he also found in Dante. There's a kind of hubris in Dante's perspective, in this need not to go home and to be a cosmopolitan, to go beyond Hesperia. This thirst for knowledge is a hubris, and it's a sin. It's also found in Tennyson and the well-known poem "The Lotus Eaters," which they get drugged by the lotus and they don't want to go home. So there's various digressions, and for me, it's it's also a theory of translation, and also my own sense of translation as a migrant. And perhaps I could add I think it's an interesting point to add to Gregory's narrative about myself. In fact, when I spent my childhood in Cyprus, but in fact I came to this country much earlier than when I studied in university. And in fact, in this respect, Liverpool, I was here in Christmas 1957, and it was the only time I've ever been here before for a week. But it was a very significant point, because it was my point in transit into English, and I should say forced transit into English, because my father had kidnapped me to bring me to Cyprus, having left my mother behind. And this was in a kind of, this was in the middle of a colonial war at the time. So to me, this was, what's this place is bringing me to, and to speak English, and this queen is not our queen. I was taught to wave a flag. And after 2-3 months in Bristol, and my refusal to engage in English culture, he said, well, we'll spend Christmas with your uncle in Liverpool. And we spent a week here. And after that, much to my surprise, I realized while I was here that in fact we were not going back to Cyprus, which was his narrative, so I was even more angry. And then even angrier, this was a transition to Manchester, in which he basically dumped me for 2 years with another uncle and his English family, and that was my forced entry into English. So in a sense, my own odyssey into translation was how I was colonized by English, but then in a sense, I had to colonize it both as a writer and as a person. And my entry into other cultures and languages has been sort of moving in and out of English. And another, I've had had some interesting conversations with people here. That's reminded